Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading our way through Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope, very slowly, with few interruptions, but we are back, and I'm hoping, maybe not every day, I'm still easing my way into BookTube. I had a guest. That guest is gone. That always makes me very sad. It's ridiculous. I should control that better, but it always happens, even if they're only here for 12 hours. So maybe not every day until I ease my way back in, but I'm hoping that we're just going to race through to the end of this book. We are within sight of the end of this book. This is a novel about a power struggle in a cathedral town in England in the 19th century. The old bishop of Barchester dies, and a new bishop goes in, and he is not known to Barchester. And he is commanded by his imperious wife and his imperious chaplain, the oily Mr. Slope. And they want to change the way things are done in Barchester, in the way worship is conducted in Barchester, which naturally sets them at odds with the huge bureaucratic power structure of Barchester, led by Archdeacon Grantley, but with lots of other people as well. There are lots of other powerful positions, clerical positions, in Barchester. And Mr. Slope is determined to have the day with all of them, and also to strengthen his own position by marrying the wealthy widow Eleanor Bold. And Mr. Slope, there's a lot he doesn't know. And there's a lot that we know that he doesn't know. Trollope does that really well in his novels. He really well plays on the tension of informing the reader of things his characters don't know about. And then just playing with that for as long as he possibly can. And he's wonderful at it. Absolutely wonderful at it. For instance, one of those positions of power in Barchester is the Dean of Barchester. And the Dean has a massive stroke recently in the chapters that we've been reading. And he is on death's door. He is neither alive nor dead. He's what one of you immortally called Schrodinger's Dean. He's neither alive nor dead. In the earlier chapter that we read, the previous chapter that we read a long time ago, sorry for the delay, but you can make a playlist out of these things so that you won't even notice it. In the previous chapter that we read, Trollope tells us that the Dean is dead in London. That the Dean has died in Barchester. And that the news has reached London, but it hasn't reached the scene of our action, Ullathorne Court. A pair of grandees, a grandee and his sister, have created this gigantic to-do for all of their people, all the people on their estate and half of Barchester. This big lawn party, multi-parts, but all of our characters are there. And also Dr. Gwynne, the head of the Oxford College of Clerics that some of our characters belong to, he is also there. He is trained in for the event. And we know, just because of the basic organics of storytelling, that a lot of stuff is going to come to a head here at Ullathorne. Mr. Slope is hoping that he will be the new dean, and that he won't need the favor of his bishop anymore. He won't need to kowtow to the bishop's wife anymore. And there's a whole bunch that he doesn't know. He doesn't know at this point that the dean is dead. But he also doesn't know what we know, which is that he is not on the list of candidates to be dean. Trollope has told us that. He dropped it as a discreet little bomb, so we know that. We also know something else, which is that Mrs. Prouty, the bishop's wife, has made it completely clear to her completely henpecked husband that Obadiah Slope's services as the bishop's personal chaplain are no longer desired. So we, the reader, know that Slope, a horrible character, someone that we want him to get his comeuppance on every level. We know it's coming. We know things he doesn't know. We know that he's about to face complete ruin because he doesn't have anything to lean back on. We know, Trollope has already told us, that he is never going to marry Eleanor Bold, that she doesn't like him, and he just doesn't know that. We know that he's never going to be dean. His name was not even on the short list. And we know that he's not welcome at the bishop's palace, that he's going to be told to pack his bags. Where is he if all three of those things happen? We're going to find out. It's expertly done, that Trollope done. So we are not going to read the next chapter after all that build-up. We are not going to read chapter 39. Let me explain just briefly. We've been told a bunch of characters who are at this big Ullathorne to-do. Two of them are families on the Ullathorne estate. The the Greenacres and the Lookalofts are two families. There's husbands, there's imperious wives, there's lots of children, and they each have their ambitions. You know, they want to be seen, country folk, they want to be seen as a little more puffed up than they are, a little bit closer to a higher social rank. And when Trollope has characters like that, no offense to Tony here, but when Trollope has characters like that, he succumbs. You saw this before in an earlier read along that I did. He succumbs to dialect. He succumbs to dialect. For his whole life, Trollope believed that he had his finger on the pulse of what poorer people think and how they act and how they talk. And no one in his life was ever willing to contradict him on that point. No one was ever willing to say, or maybe no one saw, it was after all a class-conscious Victorian society, maybe no one saw how incredibly insulting and condescending those portraits are, and they go on forever and ever. It's essentially all of chapter 39. So this book is free on Project Gutenberg. You can read chapter 39 on your own. There's no way I'm going to read you 20 minutes of, country bumpkin dialect from Trollope, especially when, as is always the case with Trollope, when you get a rude mechanicals scene like that, a country bumpkin scene like that, it is always almost a standalone thing. It does not progress the plot at all. You can skip it. In other words, I'm going to skip it. I cannot bear to think of belaboring your ears with all that nonsense. So we're going to move on to chapter 40, which isn't that, and which brings matters to a head. Because everybody is at this dig. Eleanor Bold is there, but also with her there are three men who are thinking about her romantically. There's Mr. Arabin, an ally of a new part of the clerical power structure at Barchester, an upright, decent, intellectual man who has spent a lot of time, Trollope maddeningly has not shown us much of it, but he spent a lot of time getting to know Eleanor. They've had long conversations. He has carried her little boy on his shoulders many times while wandering about in the peaceful grounds of the Archdeacon's country house. We don't see any of that, and that's maddening. We should have. But there's also Bertie Stanhope, who is the wastrel son of another member of the clerical superstructure, who is thinking, well, my father doesn't have any money. I'm not going to get anything from him when he dies. I don't have any. I'm utterly useless. I wear my pajamas during the day. So I need to marry a rich woman, or I'm going to be ruined. Doesn't really care about Eleanor, doesn't really think about her at all. They also have had friendly interactions. Eleanor loves visiting the Stanhopes. But she has no idea that a heartless plan is enacted for her to marry Bertie Stanhope. She wouldn't think about doing it. And there's also Mr. Slope, and she has no real idea that Mr. Slope plans to pitch woo to her. She knows that her friends and relatives think that he does, and she thinks they're misreading the situation. How dare you? She's outraged with them for misreading the situation into thinking that she would soil herself with someone like Mr. Slope. All of these people are here. Now, in the previous scene that we read a long time ago, pre-David Murphy, we read a scene in which Mr. Arabin comes in from the cold. He comes in from a horrible interaction that he has with the Signora Neroni, Bertie Stanhope's evil sister. He comes into the house from that conversation. He comes into dinner. There's no room for him. The Ullathorne hostess is trying to make room for him and is bringing him way too close to Eleanor. She feels too awkward, so she bolts up from her chair and leaves the room. And there's a lot of people there. It's not a big awkward moment. She bolts up from her chair and walks out through the doors to the lawn, and does not know that Mr. Slope has bolted up and followed her. He sees this as his chance. All of these men have come here, except for Mr. Arabin. All of these men have come here to propose to her. Mr. Slope follows her out onto the lawn. And that is the scene we're getting now in chapter 40. And it's a humdinger. Let's see. That which has made them drunk has made me bold. That is the first line of this chapter. That is Mr. Slope thinking that. That is a quote from Shakespeare. That's a quote from Macbeth about referring to the fact that Mr. Slope has had some wine, but instead of making him drunk, it's made him bold. But the fact of where it comes from in Macbeth is ominous, of course. It's a well-chosen quote. 'Twas thus that Mr. Slope encouraged himself as he left the dining room in pursuit of Eleanor. He had not indeed seen in that room any person really intoxicated, but there had been a good deal of wine drunk, and Mr. Slope had not hesitated to take his share in order to screw himself up to the undertaking which he had in hand. He is not the first man who has thought it expedient to call in the assistance of Bacchus on such an occasion, Bacchus being the god of wine. Eleanor was out through the window and on the grass before she perceived that she was followed. Just at that moment, the guests were nearly all occupied at the tables. Here and there were to be seen a constant couple or two who preferred their own sweet discourse to the jingle of glasses and the charms of rhetoric which fell from the mouths of the Honourable George and the Bishop of Barchester, but the grounds were as nearly vacant as Mr. Slope could wish them to be. Eleanor saw that she was pursued, and as a deer, when escape is no longer possible, will turn to bay and attack the hounds, so did she turn upon Mr. Slope. "Pray, don't let me take you from the room," she said, speaking with all the stiffness which she knew how to use. "I have come out here to look for a friend. I must beg of you, Mr. Slope, to go back." But Mr. Slope would not be thus entreated. He had observed all day that Mrs. Bold was not cordial to him, and this had, to a certain extent, had oppressed him, but he did not deduce from this any assurance that his own aspirations were in vain, naturally, because nobody exists but him. He saw that she was angry with him. Might she not be so because he had so long tampered with her feelings? Might it not arise from his having, as he knew was the case, caused her name to be bruited about in conjunction with his own, without having given her the opportunity of confessing to the world that henceforth their names were to be one and the same? Poor lady! He had within him a certain Christian conscience-stricken feeling of remorse on this head. He actually thinks the reason she's avoiding him is because she's mad that he hasn't proposed already. Oh, let's see here. It might be that he had wronged her by his tardiness. He had, however, at the present moment imbibed too much of Mr. Thorne's champagne to have any inward misgivings. He was right in repeating the boast of Lady Macbeth. He was not drunk, but he was bold enough for anything. It was a pity that in such a state he could not have encountered Mrs. Proudie. That encounter will happen soon enough. "You must permit me to attend you," said he. "I could not think of allowing you to go alone." "Indeed you must, Mr. Slope, for it is my special wish to be alone." The time for letting the great secret escape him had already come. Mr. Slope saw that it must be now or never, and he was determined that it should be now. This was not his first attempt at winning a fair lady. He had been on his knees, looked unutterable things with his eyes, and whispered honeyed words before this. Indeed, he was somewhat of an expert at these things, and had only to adapt to perhaps different taste of Mrs. Bold the well-remembered rhapsodies which had once so much gratified Olivia Proudie. He pitched woo once before to one of the bishop's daughters. Come to anything. "Do not ask me to leave you, Mrs. Bold," said he, with an impassioned look, impassioned and sanctified as well, with that sort of look which is not uncommon with gentlemen of Mr. Slope's school, and which perhaps may be called the tender pious. "Do not ask me to leave you till I have spoken a few words with which my heart is full, which I have come hither purposely to say." There's no way Eleanor Bold can avoid knowing now what she wants least to know. Now that she sees him, she might be sweet, but she's not stupid. There's no way she can avoid knowing what the reality here and how bitter a pill that is. Eleanor saw how it was now. She knew directly what it was she was about to go through, and very miserable the knowledge made her. Of course she could refuse Mr. Slope, and there would be an end of that, one might say. But there would not be an end of it as far as Eleanor was concerned. The very fact of Mr. Slope's making an offer to her would be a triumph to the Archdeacon, and in great measure a vindication of Mr. Arabin's conduct. The widow could not bring herself to endure with patience the idea that she had been in the wrong. She had defended Mr. Slope. She had declared herself quite justified in admitting him among her acquaintances, had ridiculed the idea of his considering himself as more than an acquaintance, and had resented the Archdeacon's caution in her behalf. Now it was about to be proved to her in a manner sufficiently disagreeable that the Archdeacon had been right, and she herself had been entirely wrong. "I don't know what you can have to say to me, Mr. Slope, that you could not have said when we were sitting at table just now," said she, and she closed her lips and steadied her eyeballs and looked at him in a manner that ought to have frozen him. But gentlemen are not so easily frozen when they are full of champagne, and it would not at any time have been easy to freeze Mr. Slope. "There are things, Mrs. Bold, which a man cannot well say before a crowd, which perhaps he cannot well say at any time, which indeed he may most fervently desire to get spoken, and which he may yet find it almost impossible to utter. It is such things as these that I now wish to say to you." Then the tender, pious look was repeated, with a little more emphasis even than before. Eleanor had not found it practical to stand stock still before the dining-room window, and there receive his offer in full view of Miss Thorne's guests. She had therefore, in self-defense, walked on, and thus Mr. Slope had gained his object of walking with her. He now offered her his arm. "Thank you, Mr. Slope, I am much obliged to you, but for the very short time that I shall remain with you, I prefer walking alone." "And must it be short? Must it be?" Yes, as short as possible, if you please. I had hoped, Mrs. Bold, I had hoped. Pray hope nothing, Mr. Slope. As far as I'm concerned, do not pray do not. I do not know and need not know what hope you mean. Our acquaintance is very slight, and it will remain so. Pray let that be enough. There is at any rate no necessity for us to quarrel. Mrs. Bold was certainly treating Mr. Slope rather cavalierly, and he felt it so. She was rejecting him before he had offered himself, and informed him at that same time that he was taking a great deal too much on himself to be so familiar. He was still determined to be very tender and very pious, seeing that in spite of all Mrs. Bold had said to him, he had not yet abandoned hope. But he had inclined also to be somewhat angry. The widow was bearing herself, as he thought, with too high a hand, was speaking of herself in too much imperious a tone. She had clearly no idea that an honor was being conferred on her. Mr. Slope would be tender as long as he could, but he began to think that if that failed, it would not be amiss if he also mounted himself for a while on his high horse. Mr. Slope could undoubtedly be very tender, but he could be very savage also, and he knew his own abilities. This is cruel, said he, and unchristian too. The worst of us are all still bidden to hope. What have I done that you should pass on me so severe a sentence? Then he paused a moment, during which the widow walked steadily on with measured step, saying nothing further. Beautiful woman, at last he burst forth. Yes, Eleanor, yes, I love you. I love you with the truest affection which a man can bear to a woman. Called her by her first name. Doesn't seem like anything to us in 2023. Huge deal, man, huge deal. Next to my hope of heaven are my hopes of possessing you. And here Trollope intervenes and says, Mr. Slope's memory here played him false, or he would not have omitted the deanery. The Trollope is so merciless to his own characters. How sweet to walk to heaven with you by my side, with you for my sweet guide, mutual guides. Say, Eleanor, dearest Eleanor, shall we walk that sweet path together? Eleanor had no intention of ever walking together with Mr. Slope on any path that had a special one, other than the special one of Miss Thorne's, which they now occupied. But as she had been unable to prevent the expression of Mr. Slope's wishes and aspirations, she resolved to hear him out to the end before she answered him. So he goes on. Ah, Eleanor, he continued, and it seemed to be his idea that as he had once found courage to pronounce her Christian name, he could not utter it often enough. Ah, Eleanor, will it not be sweet with the Lord's assistance to travel hand in hand through this mortal valley, which his mercies will make pleasant to us, till hereafter we shall dwell together at the foot of his throne? And then a mere tenderly pious glance than ever before gleamed in the lover's eyes. Ah, Eleanor! My name, Mr. Slope, is Mrs. Bold, said Eleanor, who, though determined to hear out the tale of his love, was much too disgusted by his blasphemy to be able to hear much more of it. Sweetest angel, be not so cold, said he. And as he said it, the champagne broke forth, and he contrived to pass his arm around her waist. He did this with a considerable cleverness, for up to this point Eleanor had contrived with tolerable success to keep her distance from him. They had got into a walk nearly enveloped by shrubs, and Mr. Slope therefore had no doubt considered, as they were now alone, it was fitting he should give her some outward demonstration of that affection of which he talked so much. It may perhaps be presumed that the same stamp of measure had been found to succeed with Olivia Proudie. Be that as it may, it was not successful with Eleanor Bold, not in the slightest. She sprang from him as she would have jumped from an adder, but she did not spring far, nor not indeed beyond arm's length, and then, quick as thought, she raised her little hand and dealt him a box on the ear with such right good will that it sounded among the trees like a miniature thunderclap. So she doesn't just not like it, she belts him. And now it is to be feared that every well-bred reader of these pages will lay down the book with disgust, feeling that, after all, the heroine is unworthy of sympathy. She is a hoyden, one will say. At any rate, she is not a lady, another will exclaim. I have suspected her all through, a third will declare. She has no idea of the dignity of a matron, or of the particular propriety of her position demands. At one moment she is romping with young Stanhope, then she is making eyes at Mr. Arabin, anon she comes to fisticuffs with a third lover, and all before she is yet a widow of 2 years' standing. She cannot altogether be defended, and yet it may be averred that she is not a hoyden. not given to romping or prone to boxing. It were to be wished devoutly that she had not struck Mr. Slope in the face. In doing so, she derogated from her dignity and committed herself. Had she been educated in Belgravia, had she been brought up in by a sterner mentor than a fond father, had she lived longer under the rule of a husband, she might perhaps have saved herself from this great fault. As it was, the provocation was too much for her, the temptation to instant resentment of the insult too strong. She was too keen in the feeling of independence, a feeling dangerous for a young woman, but one in which her position peculiarly tempted her to indulge. And then Mr. Slope's face, tinted with a deeper dye than usual by the wine he had drunk, simpering and puckering itself with pseudo-piety and tender grimaces, seemed especially to call for such punishment. It's a punchable face, in other words. She had, too, a true instinct as to the man. He was capable of rebuke in this way and no other. Her instincts tell her that the only way you're going to get this guy to back off is to hit him. And she might not be wrong. To him, the blow from her little hand was as much an insult as a blow from a man would have been to another. It went direct to his pride. He conceived himself lowered in his dignity and personally outraged. He could almost have struck her again in his rage. Even the pain was a great annoyance to him, and the feeling that his clerical character had been wholly disregarded sorely vexed him. There are such men. Men who can endure no taint on their personal self-respect, even from a woman. Men whose bodies are themselves such sacred temples that a joke against them is desecration, and a rough touch downright sacrilege. Mr. Slope was such a man, and therefore the slap on the face that he got from Eleanor was, as far as he was concerned, the fittest rebuke which could have been administered to him. But nevertheless, she should not have raised her hand against the man. Ladies' hands, so soft, so sweet, so delicious to the touch, so graceful to the eye, so gracious in their gentle doings, were not made to belabor men's faces. So says Tony. Allow me to speak on behalf of his wife and also about myself in saying that some men richly deserve it. The moment the deed was done, Eleanor felt that she had sinned against all propriety, and would have given little words to recall the blow. In her first agony of sorrow, she all but begged the man's pardon. Her next impulse, however, was the one which she obeyed, which was to run away. I will never will I speak another word to you, she said, gasping with emotion and the loss of breath which her exertion and violent feelings occasioned in her, and so saying she put foot to the ground and ran quickly back along the path to the house. How shall I sing the divine wrath of Mr. Slope, or how involve the tragic muse to describe the rage which swelled the celestial bosom of the bishop's chaplain? Such an undertaking by no means befits the low-heeled buskin of modern fiction. You do pretty good at it, Tony. Don't knock yourself. Oh, the painter put a veil over Agamemnon's face when called on to depict the father's grief at the early doom of his devoted daughter. The god, when he resolved to punish the rebellious winds, abstained from mounting empty threats. All of these are classical allusions, or allusions to Victorian painting. But you get the point. He's exaggerating. How am I going to describe how angry this creep is? We will not attempt to tell what mighty surgings of the inner heart Mr. Slope swore to revenge himself on the woman who had disgraced him, nor will we vainly strive to depict his deep agony of soul. Keep in mind, whenever you read that in Trollope, we will not attempt to do this. The next full page is going to be Trollope attempting to do that. There he is, however, alone in the garden walk, and we must contrive to bring him out of it. He was not willing to come forth quite at once. His cheek was stinging with the weight of Eleanor's fingers, and he fancied that everyone who looked upon him would be able to see on his face the traces of what he had endured. He stood a while, becoming redder and redder with rage. He stood motionless, undecided, glaring with his eyes, thinking of the pains and penalties of Hades, and meditating on how he might best devote his enemy to the infernal gods with all the passion of his accustomed eloquence. He longed in his heart to be preaching at her. 'Twas thus he was ordinarily avenged of sinning mortal men and women. Could he at once have ascended his Sunday rostrum and fulminated at her such denunciations as his spirit delighted in, his bosom would have been greatly eased. But how preach to Mrs. Thorne's laurels, or how preach indeed at all in such a vanity fair as this now going on at Ullathorne? And then he began to feel a righteous disgust at the wickedness of the doings around him. He had been justly chastised for lending, by his presence, a sanction to such worldly allures. The gaiety of society and the mirth of banquets, the laughing of the young and the eating and the drinking of elders were, for a while, without excuse in his eyes. What had he now brought down upon himself by sojourning thus in the tents of the heathen? Had he consorted with idolaters round the altars of Baal? And therefore sore punishment had come upon him. He then thought of the Signor Neroni, and his soul within him was full of sorrow. He had an inkling, a true inkling, that he was a wicked, sinful man. But it led him in no right direction. He could admit no charity in his heart. He felt debasement coming on him, and he longed to shake it off, to rise up in his stirrups, to mount a high place of great power, that he might get up into a mighty pulpit and preach to the world a loud sermon against Mrs. Bold. There he stood fixed to the gravel for about 10 minutes. Fortune favored him so far that no prying eyes could look upon him in his misery. Then a shudder passed over his whole frame. He collected himself and slowly wound his way round to the lawn, advancing along the path and not returning in the direction which Eleanor had taken. When he reached the tent, he found the bishop standing there in conversation with the master of Lazarus, Dr. Gwynne. His lordship had come out to air himself after the exertion of his speech. "This is very pleasant, my lord, is it not?" said Mr. Slope, with his most gracious smile, pointing to the tent. "Very pleasant. It is delightful to see so many persons enjoying themselves so thoroughly." Mr. Slope thought he might force the bishop to introduce him to Dr. Gwynne. A very great example had declared and practiced wisdom of being everything to everybody, and Mr. Slope was desirous of following it. His maxim was never to lose a chance. The bishop, however, at the present moment, was not very anxious to increase Mr. Slope's circle of acquaintances among his clerical brethren. He had his own reason for dropping any marked allusion to his domestic chaplain, and he therefore made his shoulder rather cold for the occasion. "Very, very," said he, without turning round and without deigning to look at Mr. Slope. "And therefore, Dr. Gwynne, I really—" See, he just continues talking to Dr. Gwynne. "And therefore, Dr. Gwynne, I really think that you will find that the Hebdomadal Board will exercise a wide and as general an authority at the present moment. I, for one, Dr. Gwynne—" Mr. Slope interrupts him and commits a social faux pas. Not as bad as referring to a married woman by her first name without her permission, but directly talking to someone without having been introduced to them. We don't think about it now, but that's what he does. "Dr. Gwynne," said Mr. Slope, raising his hat and resolving not to be outwitted by such an insignificant little goose as the Bishop of Barchester. The master of Lazarus also raised his hat and bowed very politely to Mr. Slope. "There is not a more courteous gentleman in the Queen's dominions than the master of Lazarus. My lord," said Mr. Slope, "pray do me the honor of introducing me to Dr. Gwynne. The opportunity is too much in my favor to be lost." The bishop had no help for it. "My chaplain, Dr. Gwynne," said he. "My present chaplain, Mr. Slope." Note the word. Did you catch it? He certainly made the introduction as unsatisfactory to the chaplain as possible, and by the use of the word present, seemed to indicate that Mr. Slope might probably not long enjoy the honor which he now held. But Mr. Slope cared nothing for this. He understood the innuendo and disregarded it. It might probably come to pass that he would be in a situation to resign his chaplaincy before the bishop was in a situation to dismiss him from it. What need the future dean of Barchester care for the bishop or the bishop's wife? But you're not going to be the dean of Barchester. Had not Mr. Slope, just as he was entering Dr. Stanhope's carriage, received an all-important note from Tom Towers of the Jupiter? Had he not this note at this moment in his pocket? Note's not going to help him. So, disregarding the bishop, he began to open out a conversation with the master of Lazarus. But suddenly an interruption came, not altogether unwelcome to Mr. Slope. One of the bishop's servants came up to his master's shoulder with a long, grave face and whispered into the bishop's ear. "What is it, John?" said the bishop. "The dean, my lord, is dead." Mr. Slope had no further desire to converse with the master of Lazarus, and very soon it was on his road back to Barchester. Eleanor, as we have said, had declared her intention of never holding further communication with Mr. Slope, ran hurriedly back towards the house. The thought, however, of what she had done grieved her greatly, and she could not abstain from bursting into tears. 'Twas thus she played the second act in the day's melodrama, and we are about to move on. In the day's melodrama. The day's melodrama commences again in the next chapter. This is all one enormously protracted scene, where there's much shot and incident, where much is happening, and where we as readers have been encouraged to hope that something will be resolved regarding Mrs. Bold and Mr. Arabin. We shall see. That's the beauty of a multi-part, huge scene like this. Trollope is splitting it up into cliffhangers all inside the same scene. Masterfully done. Well, the dean now, not only do we know that he's no longer Schrodinger's dean, but everybody does. So what will happen in the next chapter? Oh my, because we are approaching the end of this book. Keep in mind, a chunk of this Oxford thing is notes at the end. So we are getting close. We are coming within range of the conclusion of the book. Wonderful. So sorry for the delay. Sorry for the interruption. I will try to do this semi-regularly or regularly until we are done with Barchester Towers. Now would be a bad time to quit. So I'll wrap this up for now, and I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.